In the darkest corners of the internet, where shadows gather and whispered secrets take digital form, there exists a collection of stories that refuse to stay buried. These are not the polished tales of published authors or the carefully crafted narratives of Hollywood screenwriters. These are something far more intimate, far more unsettling. They are the modern campfire stories of our connected age, born in the anonymous depths of message boards and forums, spreading like wildfire through copy and paste, evolving with each telling until they become something larger than their origins. They are the creepypastas, and they represent a new kind of folklore for the digital era. Tonight we venture into this realm of user-generated terror to examine one particular tale that has haunted readers across the internet for years. It is a story that begins in the most ordinary of places, a small town bar where the same patron arrives every night at the same time, orders the same drink, and sits in the same corner booth facing the wall. His name is Robert Elm, and the story he eventually tells to a curious bartender is one that will chill you to your very core. But before we dive into Robert's harrowing tale, we must first understand the strange and fascinating world from which it emerged. For creepypasta is more than just a collection of scary stories. It is a cultural phenomenon that transformed how we create, share, and consume horror in the 21st century. It is the evolution of an ancient human tradition, adapted for our modern connected world. The story of creepypasta begins not in the bright dawn of the internet age, but in its murky twilight hours. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, when dial-up modems still screamed their electronic songs and forums were the beating heart of online community, something was stirring in the digital darkness. Chain emails filled with urban legends and supposed true accounts of supernatural encounters bounced from inbox to inbox, carrying with them an electric charge of fear and fascination. These emails promised terrible consequences for those who dared to break the chain, but they also offered something more compelling. They offered stories. These early digital ghost stories were crude things, often poorly written and obviously false. Yet they possessed an undeniable power. They tapped into something primal, something that connected our modern anxieties to the ancient human need to share tales of the unknown and the terrifying. They were the first tentative steps toward what would become a revolution in how horror stories were created and consumed. The transformation began around 2007 on the infamous message board known as 4chan. Here, in the site's paranormal discussion board, users began sharing brief, frightening stories designed to unnerve and disturb their fellow anonymous posters. These stories were different from the chain emails that preceded them. They were crafted specifically for the forum environment, written to be easily copied and pasted from one discussion thread to another. The users began calling these viral horror stories copypasta, a portmanteau of copy and paste that described their method of distribution. It was not long before a more specific term emerged for the horror-focused subset of these viral stories. Someone, somewhere in the anonymous depths of 4chan, coined the word creepypasta, and it stuck. The name was perfect. It captured both the method of distribution and the intent to disturb, to creep out the reader. What had begun as a simple combination of two words would soon become the label for an entire genre of digital horror. The genius of creepypasta lay not just in its method of distribution, but in its democratic nature. Anyone with access to a computer and an internet connection could become a horror author. There were no gatekeepers, no publishers to please, no editors to satisfy. The only judge was the anonymous crowd, and their verdict was rendered not in reviews or ratings, but in the simple act of copying and pasting. If a story was good enough to share, it survived. If it was not, it vanished into the digital void. This democratic approach to horror creation led to an explosion of creativity and experimentation. Writers freed from the constraints of traditional publishing began pushing boundaries and exploring themes that might never have seen the light of day in conventional venues. Some stories were simple and direct, designed to deliver a quick shock or a moment of unease. Others were complex, multi-layered narratives that unfolded over multiple posts and incorporated multimedia elements like images, videos, and interactive websites. The community that grew around these stories was unlike anything that had existed before in the horror genre. It was collaborative, anonymous, and constantly evolving. Stories were not just consumed passively. They were remixed, expanded, and transformed by the community. A single creepypasta might spawn dozens of variations, each one building on or subverting the elements that came before. Characters from different stories would cross over into new narratives, creating a shared universe of digital terror. Perhaps no single creepypasta better exemplifies the power and potential of this new form of horror storytelling than the legendary tale of Slender Man. Created in 2009 by Eric Knudsen as part of a Photoshop contest on the Something Awful forums, Slender Man began as nothing more than two doctored photographs showing a tall, faceless figure in a business suit lurking in the background of what appeared to be vintage photographs of children. Knudsen included brief, cryptic captions that hinted at mysterious disappearances and unexplained events. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, other users were creating their own Slender Man images and stories. Within days, entire websites were dedicated to chronicling his fictional exploits. Within months, he had become a full-fledged cultural phenomenon, inspiring video games, web series, documentaries, and eventually a Hollywood film. The anonymous forum post had become a modern myth, a digital deity born from the collective imagination of the internet. But Slender Man was just the beginning. The success of Eric Knudsen's creation proved that creepypasta could transcend its humble origins and enter the mainstream cultural consciousness. It opened the floodgates for a new generation of digital horror creators who saw the internet not just as a distribution platform, but as a creative medium in its own right. This brings us to the tale we are here to explore tonight. The Tale of Robert Elm represents a different approach to creepypasta than the viral collaborative nature of Slender Man. Written by an author known as G1 Pringle, it is a more traditional horror narrative, complete and self-contained, designed to be read as a single sitting rather than experienced as an evolving, community-driven phenomenon. Yet it embodies many of the key characteristics that make creepypasta such a powerful form of digital horror. It begins in the most mundane of settings, a small town bar, and slowly builds an atmosphere of dread and unease. It uses the first-person narrative voice that has become a hallmark of the genre, creating an intimate connection between the reader and the story being told. Most importantly, it understands that the most effective horror comes not from external monsters, but from the darkness that lurks within the human heart and mind. The story opens with what appears to be a simple character study. Every night at 10 o'clock sharp, a man enters the Spade Bar, orders an Irish whiskey, and takes his seat at the back left table, always facing the wall. He drinks in silence until just before dawn, then leaves without a word. This ritual continues night after night, year after year, until the bartender's curiosity finally overcomes his professional discretion. What follows is a tale that begins in November 1962, in a small rural town in Iowa, a place where everyone knew everyone else, where doors were left unlocked and children played in the streets without fear. It was the kind of place that seemed insulated from the darkness of the wider world, protected by its isolation and the simple goodness of its people. But as Robert Elm's tale unfolds, we learn that no place, no matter how small or seemingly safe, is truly protected from the forces that lurk in the shadows of human existence. The genius of the Tale of Robert Elm lies in its patient, methodical approach to building dread, like the best creepypasta authors. G1 Pringle understands that true horror comes not from sudden shocks or graphic violence, but from the slow, inexorable realization that the world is not what it appears to be. The story takes its time, establishing its characters and setting with careful detail, before gradually pulling back the curtain to reveal the nightmare lurking beneath. This approach reflects one of the key innovations of creepypasta as a horror medium. Freed from the length constraints of traditional publishing and the commercial pressures of mass-market entertainment, creepypasta authors could take the time to build genuine atmosphere and develop their characters as real, three-dimensional people rather than simple vessels for scares. The result was horror that felt more personal, more intimate, and ultimately more effective than much of what was being produced through conventional channels. The Tale of Robert Elm also exemplifies another crucial element that distinguishes creepypasta from traditional horror fiction. It is deeply rooted in the specificity of place and time. The story does not unfold in some generic haunted mansion or ancient castle, but in a carefully detailed small Iowa town in 1962. A world of church socials and neighborhood barbecues, of unlocked doors and borrowed cups of sugar. This grounding in recognizable reality serves a vital purpose. It makes the supernatural elements that emerge feel not like fantasy, but like a corruption of the world we know and understand. This technique reflects the broader evolution of horror storytelling in the digital age. Where Gothic horror relied on exotic locations and historical distance to create its effects, creepypasta found its power in the familiar and the contemporary. The most effective stories in the genre were those that could make the reader's own world feel suddenly unsafe, that could transform the mundane details of everyday life into sources of potential terror. The community that formed around these stories was equally revolutionary. Unlike traditional horror publishing, where authors worked in isolation and readers consumed their work passively, creepypasta created a collaborative environment where the line between creator and audience became beautifully blurred. Readers would leave comments that influenced future stories, suggest plot developments, or even create their own variations and sequels. The stories became living entities, growing and evolving through the collective imagination of their audience. This collaborative spirit extended beyond individual stories to encompass entire fictional universes. Writers began creating shared mythologies, interconnected narratives that spanned multiple authors and stories. The SCP Foundation, perhaps the most successful of these collaborative horror projects, began as a simple creepypasta concept, but grew into a vast open-source horror universe containing thousands of entries written by hundreds of contributors. It demonstrated that the democratic nature of internet horror could produce works of staggering scope and complexity. Yet, for all its innovation and community spirit, creepypasta remained fundamentally rooted in the ancient human tradition of storytelling. The stories served the same function that ghost stories had served around campfires for millennia. They allowed people to explore their fears in a safe environment, to confront the darkness of existence while remaining secure in the knowledge that they were only stories. They provided a communal experience of terror that brought people together even as it frightened them. The Tale of Robert Elm embodies these ancient storytelling traditions, while embracing the possibilities of its digital medium. The frame narrative, with the mysterious regular customer finally revealing his secret to the bartender, echoes the structure of countless folk tales and urban legends. The careful attention to atmospheric detail, the gradual build of tension, the focus on psychological rather than physical horror, all demonstrate a deep understanding of what makes horror effective across any medium. But the story also uses elements that are uniquely suited to the creepypasta format. The first-person narrative creates an intimacy that draws the reader directly into Robert's experience. The specific historical setting provides a sense of authenticity that makes the supernatural elements more believable. The self-contained nature of the tale makes it perfect for the copy-and-paste distribution method that gave creepypasta its name. As Robert begins to unfold his tale to the curious bartender, we are transported back to that November evening in 1962 when his ordinary life in small-town Iowa took a turn toward the inexplicable and the terrifying. The story that emerges is one of secret societies and ancient rituals, of neighbors who are not what they seem and darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the most innocent communities. The Black Circle, as Robert calls them, represents one of humanity's most primal fears. The fear that the people we trust, the communities we depend upon, may harbor secrets that could destroy us. This theme resonates particularly strongly in the context of small-town America in 1962, a time and place that represented safety and innocence in the popular imagination. By setting his horror story in this idealized environment, G1 Pringle taps into a deep well of cultural anxiety about the fragility of our assumptions and the darkness that may lurk behind the most benevolent facades. The ritual elements of Robert's story, The mysterious ceremonies and ancient symbols connect the tale to a rich tradition of occult horror that stretches back through writers like H.P. Lovecraft, the Gothic novels of the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet these elements are grounded in the specific reality of mid-century rural America, making them feel not like exotic fantasy but like a hidden truth about the world we thought we knew. The character of Valentine Ambrose Lombard II serves as the story's primary antagonist, though his true nature remains tantalizingly obscure throughout much of the narrative. Like the best horror villains, he is defined as much by what we do not know about him as by what we do. His very name suggests old money and established power, the kind of influence that could easily remain hidden in a small community where everyone minds their own business and uncomfortable questions are rarely asked. The goat headdress is worn by the members of the Black Circle tap into symbolism that is both ancient and immediately recognizable. The goat has been associated with darkness and the demonic across cultures and centuries, yet in the context of rural Iowa, these symbols take on a particularly unsettling quality. They suggest that the pastoral innocence of farm country may be nothing more than a thin veneer covering something far more primitive and threatening. The neophyte's sacrament, with its use of hallucinogenic substances to test newcomers, reflects the story's understanding that the most effective horror comes not from external threats but from the loss of our ability to trust our own perceptions. When we cannot rely on our senses to tell us what is real, when the very act of perception becomes unreliable, we lose our most basic tool for navigating the world safely. This theme of unreliable perception runs throughout the best creepypasta stories. In a medium where the only connection between author and reader is text on a screen, where the traditional markers of authority and authenticity are absent, the question of what is real becomes particularly acute. The stories work precisely because they exist in this liminal space between truth and fiction, reality and imagination. Robert's encounter with the grotesque figure in his apartment represents the story's climax, the moment when the hidden horror finally reveals itself in all its terrifying glory. The description of this entity with its pale green eyes and mangled grin demonstrates the author's skill at creating visceral horror through precise, economical language. The image is specific enough to be genuinely frightening, yet ambiguous enough to allow each reader's imagination to fill in the most terrifying details. This balance between specificity and ambiguity is one of the hallmarks of effective horror writing, and it is particularly important in the creepypasta medium. Without the visual and auditory elements that film and television can employ, text-based horror must rely entirely on the reader's imagination to create its effects. The most successful creepypasta authors understand this limitation and turn it into a strength, providing just enough detail to guide the reader's imagination, while leaving room for their own fears to take hold. The enduring popularity of the Tale of Robert Elm within the creepypasta community speaks to its effectiveness as a horror narrative. Unlike some stories that rely on shock value or graphic imagery for their impact, this tale creates a sustained atmosphere of dread that lingers long after the reading is complete. It understands that the most powerful horror comes not from what we see, but from what we imagine lurking just beyond our vision. The story's structure, with its frame narrative and gradual revelation, also demonstrates the sophisticated storytelling techniques that emerged within the creepypasta community. These were not the crude, hastily written tales that characterized the genre's earliest days, but carefully crafted narratives that could stand alongside the best traditional horror fiction. They showed that the democratic nature of internet publishing could produce works of genuine literary merit. The setting of Robert's tale that November evening in 1962 carries with it the weight of historical specificity that elevates the narrative beyond simple supernatural horror. This was America at the height of the Cold War, a time when the very notion of hidden enemies and secret conspiracies carried particular resonance. The fear that one's neighbors might harbor dangerous secrets, that the foundations of small-town life might be built upon deception and malevolent purpose, tapped into anxieties that were very real and very present in the cultural consciousness of the era. Yet G1 Pringle's genius lies not in exploiting these historical fears directly, but in using them as a foundation upon which to build something more timeless and universal. The Black Circle is not a metaphor for communist infiltration or foreign influence. It is something far more ancient and far more terrifying. It represents the possibility that evil has always been with us, woven into the very fabric of human community, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. The ritual aspects of Robert's story draw from a well of human experience that predates any specific historical moment. The use of ceremonial garments, the gathering in secret places, the initiation of newcomers through trials that test their worthiness, these elements speak to patterns of human behavior that have persisted across cultures and centuries. They suggest that beneath the surface of our modern, rational world, older and more primitive forces continue to operate according to their own inexorable logic. The character of Valentine Ambrose Lombard II embodies this tension between the modern and the ancient. His name suggests refinement, education, perhaps European ancestry and old family money. He is the kind of figure who might serve on hospital boards and donate to local charities, whose respectability would be unquestioned in a community that values stability and tradition. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization lurks something that belongs to an altogether different order of existence. This duality reflects one of the most persistent themes in American horror fiction, the idea that the wilderness is never truly tamed, that beneath the ordered surface of civilized life, chaos and darkness wait to reassert their dominion. The small Iowa town of Robert's memory represents humanity's attempt to create a pocket of safety and predictability in an uncertain world. The Black Circle represents the failure of that attempt, the revelation that our safe spaces are illusions, that the darkness we thought we had banished was simply hiding, waiting for its moment to emerge. The use of hallucinogenic substances in the neophyte's sacrament adds another layer of complexity to the narrative. These substances, which alter perception and break down the barriers between conscious and unconscious experience, serve a dual purpose in the story. On one level, they provide a rational explanation for the supernatural elements that Robert witnesses. Perhaps what he experienced was nothing more than a drug-induced hallucination, the product of a mind pushed beyond its normal limits by chemical intervention. Yet this rational explanation only makes the story more unsettling, not less. If Robert's experiences were hallucinations, then they represent the deepest fears of his own psyche made manifest. The grotesque figure he encounters becomes not an external enemy, but a projection of his own internal darkness. This possibility transforms the story from a tale of supernatural horror into something more psychologically complex and disturbing. An exploration of the capacity for evil that exists within the human mind itself. The ambiguity between supernatural and psychological explanations is a hallmark of the most sophisticated horror fiction. It allows the story to work on multiple levels simultaneously, providing different readers with different ways of understanding and interpreting the events described. Some will see Robert's tale as a straightforward account of supernatural encounter. Others will read it as a study in psychological breakdown and paranoid delusion. Both interpretations are valid, and both are equally terrifying in their own way. This multiplicity of meaning reflects the broader evolution of horror fiction in the 20th century. As writers moved away from the certainties of earlier Gothic traditions toward more ambiguous and psychologically complex narratives. The great horror writers of the modern era, from Shirley Jackson to Thomas Ligotti, understood that uncertainty is more frightening than certainty, that the fear of madness can be more terrifying than the fear of monsters. The creepypasta medium proved particularly well suited to this kind of ambiguous horror. The anonymous nature of internet publishing meant that readers had no external authority to appeal to in determining the truth or falsehood of what they were reading. The stories existed in a liminal space between fact and fiction, reality and imagination, where the normal markers of credibility were absent or unreliable. This uncertainty was not a bug in the system but a feature. It allowed creepypasta authors to create a sense of unease that extended beyond the boundaries of their narratives. Readers found themselves questioning not just the events described in the stories, but the nature of the stories themselves. Were they fiction or fact? Were they the products of creative imagination or genuine accounts of supernatural encounter? The inability to answer these questions definitively became part of the horror experience. The Tale of Robert Elm exploits this uncertainty masterfully. The frame narrative, with its anonymous bartender and mysterious regular customer, provides just enough distance from the central events to create plausible deniability while maintaining the intimacy necessary for effective horror. We are not reading Robert's own account of his experiences, but a second-hand report from someone who claims to have heard it directly from the source. This additional layer of mediation introduces further possibilities for distortion and misunderstanding. Perhaps the bartender has misremembered or embellished certain details. Perhaps Robert himself was lying or delusional. Perhaps the entire encounter in the bar never happened at all, and the story is nothing more than an urban legend that has grown in the telling. These possibilities do not diminish the story's power. They enhance it. The uncertainty becomes part of the horror, a reminder that in a world where truth and fiction blur together, we can never be entirely sure of what is real. The grotesque figure that Robert encounters in his apartment represents the story's most concrete manifestation of horror, yet it remains tantalizingly vague in its description. The pale green eyes and mangled grin are specific enough to create a vivid mental image, yet the overall appearance of the entity is left largely to the reader's imagination. This technique demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how horror works in written form. Visual media can show us monsters in explicit detail, but literature must rely on suggestion and implication to create its effects. The most effective literary horror leaves gaps for the reader's imagination to fill. Understanding that what we imagine is often more frightening than what we are shown. Our own minds, drawing from our personal fears and anxieties, can create images more terrifying than any external description. The setting of Robert's apartment adds another dimension to this climactic encounter. This is not some remote location or ancient building with a history of supernatural activity. It is the most mundane and personal of spaces, a place that should represent safety and privacy. The intrusion of the grotesque figure into this intimate space violates one of our most basic assumptions about the boundaries between public and private, known and unknown. This violation of domestic space is a recurring theme in effective horror fiction. Our homes are meant to be refuges from the chaos and danger of the outside world. When that refuge is compromised, when the very space that should protect us becomes a source of threat, our sense of security is fundamentally undermined. We are left with nowhere to hide, no safe space to retreat to when the darkness comes calling. The timing of the encounter in the dead of night when Robert is alone and vulnerable adds to its psychological impact. Night has always been associated with fear and uncertainty in human consciousness. It is the time when our rational defenses are weakened, when the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes blurred, when the familiar world transforms into something strange and threatening. The fact that Robert's visitor appears at his window, looking in from the outside darkness, taps into one of our most primal fears. Windows are meant to provide a barrier between the safety of the interior and the danger of the exterior. Yet they are also points of vulnerability, transparent boundaries that can be breached by those with malevolent intent. The image of a grotesque face peering through a window at night resonates with fears that reach back to our earliest childhood experiences. The aftermath of this encounter, Robert's flight from his hometown and his subsequent years of nightly drinking, provides the story with its emotional core. The horror is not just in the supernatural encounter itself, but in its lasting psychological impact. Robert is not just a man who saw something terrible. He is a man whose entire sense of reality has been shattered, who can no longer trust the world he thought he knew. His nightly ritual at the Spade Bar becomes a form of self-medication, an attempt to numb the memories that continue to haunt him decades after the original events. The Irish whiskey serves as both literal alcohol and symbolic representation of his desire to forget, to blur the sharp edges of recollection that continue to cut him whenever his guard is down. The choice to have Robert face the wall while drinking is particularly significant. It suggests a man who can no longer bear to look outward at the world, who has turned inward in his attempt to escape the implications of what he witnessed. The wall becomes a barrier not just between himself and other patrons of the bar, but between himself and a reality that has proven too terrible to confront directly. This psychological aftermath distinguishes the Tale of Robert Elm from simpler horror narratives that focus solely on the moment of terror. The story understands that true horror lies not just in the encounter with the unknown, but in the lasting damage that such encounters can inflict on the human psyche. Robert's decades of solitary drinking represent a form of living death, an existence drained of joy and hope by the knowledge of what lurks in the shadows of ordinary life. The decision to finally tell his story to the bartender represents a crucial turning point in Robert's psychological journey. After years of silence and isolation, he chooses to share his burden with another human being. This act of confession serves multiple purposes within the narrative structure. It provides the frame that allows the story to be told, but it also suggests the possibility of redemption or at least relief through the act of testimony. The sharing of horror stories serves an ancient human function. By telling our fears to others, we make them communal rather than individual experiences. We transform private terrors into shared knowledge, diluting their power through the act of communication. The bartender becomes not just a listener, but a witness, someone who can validate Robert's experience and perhaps help him bear the weight of his terrible knowledge. Yet the story offers no easy resolution or comfort. The bartender listens but does not judge, does not offer explanations or reassurances. The horror remains intact, undiminished by the telling. If anything, it has now been passed on, shared with another person who must decide what to believe and how to process the implications of what he has heard. This refusal to provide closure or explanation reflects the mature understanding of horror that characterizes the best creepypasta fiction. The stories do not seek to explain away their mysteries or provide comfortable resolutions to their conflicts. They understand that the most effective horror comes from uncertainty and ambiguity, from questions that remain unanswered and fears that cannot be easily dismissed. The enduring power of the Tale of Robert Elm lies in its ability to transform the familiar into the threatening, to show us that the world we think we know may be nothing more than a comforting illusion. It reminds us that beneath the surface of our ordered existence, older and darker forces may be at work, following their own inexorable logic and waiting patiently for their moment to emerge from the shadows. In the end, Robert's tale becomes our tale, a reminder that we are all potentially just one encounter away from having our comfortable assumptions about reality shattered forever. The story succeeds because it makes us complicit in its horror, forcing us to confront the possibility that the darkness it describes is not confined to the pages of fiction, but may be lurking in the shadows of our own seemingly safe and ordinary lives. This transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, the safe into the threatening, represents one of the fundamental achievements of creepypasta as a horror medium. Where traditional Gothic horror relied on exotic locations and supernatural creatures to create its effects, The digital age demanded something more intimate, more immediate. The monsters that truly frightened us were not the vampires in distant castles, or the werewolves in ancient forests, but the neighbors who smiled too widely, the communities that harbored secrets, the familiar spaces that revealed themselves to be anything but safe. The genius of Robert's encounter lies not in its supernatural elements, but in its complete violation of the social contract that holds civilized society together. The black circle represents the collapse of trust, the revelation that the bonds of community which we depend upon for our very survival may be nothing more than elaborate deceptions. When Robert discovers that his neighbors are not what they seem, when the friendly faces of his small town reveal themselves to be masks concealing something ancient and malevolent, his entire worldview crumbles. This theme resonates with particular power in the context of American small-town life. The mythology of rural America as a bastion of innocence and moral clarity has deep roots in our cultural consciousness. It represents our collective desire for simplicity, for a world where good and evil are clearly defined, where neighbors can be trusted and children can play safely in the streets. The horror of Robert's tale lies in its systematic destruction of these comforting assumptions. The ritual elements described in the story tap into fears that are both ancient and thoroughly modern. The image of respected community members gathering in secret, wearing ritual garments and performing ceremonies that violate every norm of civilized behavior, speaks to our deepest anxieties about the fragility of social order. It suggests that the veneer of civilization is thinner than we like to believe, that beneath our rational, ordered existence, primitive forces continue to exert their influence. The use of hallucinogenic substances in the neophyte's sacrament adds another layer of psychological complexity to the narrative. These chemicals, which dissolve the boundaries between perception and imagination, between the conscious and unconscious mind, serve as a bridge between the rational world that Robert thought he knew and the irrational world that he discovers lurking beneath its surface. The drugs do not create the horror he witnesses, but they remove the filters that normally protect us from seeing reality in all its terrifying complexity. This pharmacological element reflects a broader understanding of consciousness that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century. The widespread experimentation with mind-altering substances during the 1960s revealed the extent to which our perception of reality is constructed, filtered, and limited by the normal functioning of our brains. The possibility that there might be layers of existence normally hidden from our awareness became not just a philosophical speculation, but a lived reality for millions of people. In the context of Robert's story, the hallucinogens serve a dual purpose. They provide a rational explanation for the supernatural elements he witnesses, suggesting that his terrifying visions might be nothing more than chemically induced hallucinations. Yet this explanation only makes the story more disturbing, not less. If Robert's experience was a hallucination, then it represents the deepest contents of his own unconscious mind made manifest. The monsters he encounters become not external enemies, but projections of his own internal darkness. This ambiguity between external and internal reality, between supernatural encounter and psychological breakdown, reflects one of the most sophisticated techniques employed by modern horror writers. By refusing to provide definitive answers about the nature of the threats their characters face, these authors create a sense of uncertainty that extends far beyond the boundaries of their narratives. Readers are left to grapple with questions that have no clear answers, to confront possibilities that resist easy categorization. The character of Valentine Ambrose Lombard II embodies this deliberate ambiguity. His very name suggests refinement and respectability, the kind of old money aristocracy that forms the backbone of small-town social hierarchies. He is precisely the sort of person who would be above suspicion, whose involvement in anything unseemly would be unthinkable to his neighbors and associates. This respectability becomes his most effective disguise, a social camouflage that allows him to operate with impunity in the shadows of community life. The horror of Lombard's character lies not in any obvious monstrosity, but in his complete ordinariness. He represents the terrifying possibility that evil wears a human face, that the people we trust most may be the ones most capable of betraying that trust. This theme has particular resonance in the context of small-town life, where social relationships are built on personal knowledge and mutual dependence. When those relationships are revealed to be founded on deception, the entire fabric of community life begins to unravel. The goat imagery associated with the black circle draws from a rich tradition of occult symbolism that stretches back through centuries of Western culture. The goat has been associated with the diabolic and the transgressive since ancient times, representing the untamed instinctual aspects of human nature that civilized society seeks to suppress. In the context of rural Iowa, where agriculture and animal husbandry form the foundation of economic life, this symbolism takes on additional layers of meaning. The transformation of the familiar farm animal into a symbol of dark ritual represents the corruption of the pastoral ideal that lies at the heart of American rural mythology. The goat, which should represent the wholesome relationship between humans and the natural world, becomes instead a sign of humanity's capacity for perversion and evil. This inversion of meaning reflects the broader theme of the story, the revelation that the innocent surface of small-town life conceals depths of moral corruption. The ritual use of these symbols suggests the presence of beliefs and practices that predate the Christian civilization that ostensibly governs community life. The black circle represents not just a contemporary conspiracy, but the persistence of older, more primitive forms of human organization. Their ceremonies suggest that beneath the surface of modern rational society, archaic patterns of thought and behavior continue to exert their influence. This temporal layering, the suggestion that the past continues to live within the present, reflects one of the fundamental insights of horror fiction. The genre has always been concerned with the return of the repressed, the way that forces we thought we had overcome or transcended continue to shape our lives in ways we do not fully understand. The black circle becomes a manifestation of humanity's shadow self, the dark impulses and primitive drives that civilized society has attempted to eliminate but has only succeeded in hiding. The grotesque figure that appears at Robert's window represents the story's most direct confrontation with this hidden darkness. The description of this entity with its pale green eyes and mangled grin suggests something that is recognizably human yet fundamentally altered, transformed by forces that operate outside the normal boundaries of human experience. It is neither fully natural nor completely supernatural, but something that exists in the liminal space between categories. This ambiguous nature makes the figure more terrifying than any conventional monster. We can prepare ourselves for the purely supernatural, dismiss it as fantasy or delusion. We can understand the purely human even when it is evil or dangerous, but something that partakes of both categories while belonging fully to neither challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality. It forces us to confront the possibility that the boundaries we use to organize our understanding of the world may be far more permeable than we like to believe. The timing and location of this encounter add to its psychological impact. The figure appears at night when our rational defenses are weakened and our unconscious fears are closest to the surface. It appears at Robert's window, violating the boundary between the safety of the interior and the danger of the exterior. Most significantly, it appears in his own apartment, the space that should represent ultimate privacy and security. This violation of domestic space taps into one of our most fundamental fears. Our homes are meant to be refuges from the chaos and unpredictability of the outside world. They represent our attempt to create islands of order and control in a universe that often seems hostile to human flourishing. When that refuge is compromised, when the very space that should protect us becomes a source of threat, our most basic assumptions about safety and security are undermined. The aftermath of this encounter, Robert's immediate flight from his hometown and his subsequent decades of nightly drinking, provides the story with its emotional resonance. The horror is not confined to the moment of supernatural confrontation, but extends into every aspect of his subsequent existence. He becomes a man haunted not just by what he has seen, but by the implications of what that vision means for his understanding of reality itself. His nightly ritual at the Spade Bar takes on the character of a religious observance, a desperate attempt to find some form of meaning or solace in a world that has been stripped of its comforting illusions. The Irish whiskey becomes a sacrament of forgetfulness, a chemical communion that offers temporary respite from memories too terrible to bear in full consciousness. Yet the very repetitive nature of this ritual suggests its ultimate futility. The horror cannot be permanently numbed or forgotten, only temporarily held at bay. The choice to sit facing the wall while drinking reflects Robert's complete withdrawal from human contact and engagement. He has become a man who can no longer bear to look outward at the world, who has turned his back on the possibility of connection or community. The wall represents not just a physical barrier but a psychological one, a boundary he has erected between himself and a reality that has proven too threatening to confront directly. This psychological isolation reflects one of the most profound forms of horror: the fear of being forever cut off from human fellowship by knowledge that cannot be shared or understood. Robert's experience has placed him outside the normal boundaries of human community. He has seen something that his neighbors cannot comprehend, experienced something that would mark him as delusional or mad if he were to speak of it openly. This enforced silence becomes a form of spiritual death, a severing of the bonds that connect him to his fellow human beings. The decision to finally break this silence, to tell his story to the anonymous bartender, represents a crucial moment of choice. After decades of isolation and self-medication, Robert chooses to risk the possibility of disbelief or ridicule in exchange for the chance of human connection. This act of testimony becomes not just a narrative device, but a fundamental assertion of his humanity, a refusal to let the horror he has witnessed reduce him to complete solitude. Yet the story offers no guarantee that this testimony will provide the relief or redemption that Robert seeks. The bartender listens without judgment, but also without providing the validation or understanding that might ease Robert's burden. The horror remains intact, undiminished by the telling. If anything, it has now been passed on, shared with another person who must decide how to process the implications of what he has heard. This refusal to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions reflects the sophisticated understanding of horror that characterizes the best examples of the genre. True terror cannot be easily explained away or resolved through rational analysis. It exists in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between the known and the unknown, between the possible and the impossible. The most effective horror stories understand that their power lies not in providing answers, but in asking questions that cannot be easily dismissed. And so we reach the end of our journey into the shadowed realm of digital horror, having followed Robert Elm from that November night in 1962 to his solitary vigil at the Spade Bar, and from there into the broader landscape of creepypasta culture that gave his tale its enduring power. We have seen how the ancient human tradition of storytelling adapted to the connected age, how the campfire became the forum, how the whispered tale became the viral post. We have witnessed the birth of a new kind of folklore, one that spreads not through generations of oral tradition, but through the instantaneous networks of our digital world. The Tale of Robert Elm stands as a testament to the enduring power of horror, to reveal uncomfortable truths about the human condition. It reminds us that beneath the surface of our ordered existence, older and darker forces continue to operate according to their own inexorable logic. It shows us that the boundaries between the familiar and the threatening, between the safe and the dangerous, are far more fragile than we like to believe. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the most effective horror comes not from external monsters, but from the recognition that the darkness we fear most may already be dwelling within the communities we call home. As you go about your daily life in your own small towns and neighborhoods, as you pass familiar faces on familiar streets, remember Robert's story. Remember that the most terrifying tales are not always the ones that take place in distant castles or ancient graveyards, but the ones that unfold behind the windows of houses just like yours, in communities just like the one where you live. For in the end, the true legacy of creepypasta lies not in its technological innovation or its democratic distribution, but in its ability to transform the ordinary world into a source of extraordinary terror. Sleep well tonight if you can.